Dalton. He is the Ewald Grether Professor in Business Administration and Marketing, also Barbara and Gershon Bakar Faculty Fellow and a distinguished Teaching Fellow at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. He studies consumer well-being, judgment, decision-making, and research credibility, among many other topics. And if you did the required readings before the training, you may be familiar with his work on the PCurve. This is something that he will be talking about today. Also in his presentation, he will talk about how to critically think about statistical evidence and how not to fall prey to p-values. So with that, Leif, thanks for joining us and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Alex, and thanks to everybody else for being here. A couple of things before I sort of get into the details. So I lack the mental acuity to monitor chat while also communicating. So if you put something in the chat, it's totally fine with me, so long as you assume that I won't see it. Katie and Alex will hopefully see it. Even better, though, would be if you use the hand raise function or simply unmute yourself and speak up. As Alex said, I teach in a business school, and the business school norms of pedagogy are that every MBA student feels like at every given moment, it is really, really important for them to express themselves in the classroom. So I'm accustomed to 70 people interrupting me to say something. I'm not encouraging you to all do that at the same time, but feel fairly comfortable with it. I mean, as Alex alludes to, I will talk about p-values today. I'm going to try to put it in a bigger context where I will talk about, in general, what are the things that we like to see from good evidence versus bad evidence. I'll talk a little bit about selective reporting, which undoubtedly has come up already, and it lurks in a lot of the readings that you've already done. But I'm also going to talk about fraud, and in the context of that, we'll hopefully also have at least a brief discussion about some of how this relates to issues of scientific ethics. I'm supposed to talk for about an hour. I don't care if I get through all my slides. I do care about going too long, so I will try to cap myself at the hour because I know you'd all want to get to something else. We have people from all over the world for whom it is already very late, and so even later is worse. Okay, so when we think about what strong evidence looks like, really what we mean is what does weak evidence look like? The assumption of scientific literature is that the evidence should be strong, otherwise we wouldn't be seeing it, otherwise it wouldn't count as evidence. And so what we're really trying to do is to figure out how to be good at scrutinizing it, identify those things that are potentially problematic. Now, most of the examples I'm going to talk through today will come from the land of psychology. I'm a psychologist by background. And so it means that when I am criticizing something, it's basically like me pointing the finger at myself. Whereas if I only criticized economics or political science, it would make me seem sort of smug. And I don't want to seem that way. I want to seem self-critical. But it should apply across all disciplines. So if the goal of science is to distinguish what is true or replicable, is sort of our operational definition, from what is false, then we want to know how to do that and what are the consequences. So false findings are bad, and we sort of understand that, but I think often people don't recognize how truly bad they are. So when we publish false findings, it defeats the central purpose of science, which is to be able to make accurate predictions about other things in the world. Essentially, predicting the future is the value of science. And so clearly, if you have false findings, it makes your predictions less accurate. That's bad. It makes it harder to publish true findings. That's because the false findings are crowding out the true ones and also making it harder for the true things to distinguish themselves. False findings, again, bad. It also, the mere presence of lots of false findings in literature incentivizes bad research practices, and therefore more false findings. So basically, this is just a reminder that false positives, false findings, they're just bad for everybody. Great. Okay. There's a couple of things that we can do to try to remove false findings. One is to do open science. Of course, that's the whole topic here. If everyone is doing their transparent reporting, their pre-registrations, their pre-analysis plans, their open sharing of materials and data, that's good. Let's assume that not everyone is instantly on board with that. The other half of the equation is for us to read everything else and evaluate it effectively. That is, identifying which papers, which findings aren't as strong. So I'm going to focus on 3 threats to validity. I'll spend most of the time on the first 2, and we'll see how we get to the third. Selective reporting in different ways clearly matters, and it's the part of the topic of what Ted was just referring to. Either p-hacking or file during whole studies. Fraud, sort of making up data from scratch or adjusting it in a way that is not simply selective reporting, or errors or hidden confounds. And this is sort of a lurking case-specific version that has always been there, and our field is meant to be good at protecting against, but it's deeply related to open science. So I'll get to a couple of examples of that towards the end. Okay, so p-hacking, you already know here, I'm accustomed to, or I'm prepared to do a 90-minute version of what I will do in 25 seconds. But basically, when people do analyses, there's many, many decisions they can make, all of which are plausibly justifiable. And so if there's many analytic decisions you could make, the one thing you're going to do is use the ones you like the most for trying to make claims about your findings, about your data. And so if you can justify any of them, you're going to tend to justify the ones that generate a significant result. Great. So if we only report the analyses that are p less than 0.05, then we're going to have a biased version. Great. Okay. So now you can ask, so I believe p-hacking exists. Here, there's a few ways of thinking about the prevalence of p-hacking. I tend to, when I frame this, as we don't need to really ask the question, is p-hacking happening? Not even in an individual paper. We should just assume, of course it is. P-hacking happens all the time. It's not some novel, exotic crime. It's default. And so we want to know how severe it is and how much it compromises the evidence. So we want to look for the symptoms of p-hacking that is severe enough to matter. Okay, so I mentioned symptoms, and we can think of it sort of like medical symptoms. And that you say, great, they are diagnostic of something, but they're not necessarily perfectly so, right? So we're going to look for signals, knowing full well that they're not always going to be sufficient. So we have to consider a whole set of symptoms in order to really say, wait a minute, there's enough evidence of p-hacking that I am going to distrust this finding, or maybe there's such a lack of symptoms that I am going to trust it. Again, this strong evidence, weak evidence designation that we're looking for. Okay, so there's a few things that we can do. Is the study's result surprising? Too good to be true or too large? And here, that sounds like a really dumb thing to focus on, but I don't know as much about how this works in economics because they pride themselves on being quite distant from their intuitions. But in psychology, we've in some ways given up on this. So the more exotic and weird the finding, the more we're like, that must be neat, and that's backwards. It is actually pretty useful to hold on to our intuitions. I'll talk about where those might be generated. So what would count as surprising? If someone's running an experiment, collecting data, doing some novel analysis, it is necessarily the case that they don't know the answer. If they already knew the answer that they would obtain, they wouldn't do the analysis, they wouldn't run the study. So what they have is a guess. And us as readers should have guesses too. So we can do some calibrations here for thinking about what is not surprising versus what is. So I'm going to show you, so I collected some data with my colleagues, Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson, that are co-authors on pretty much everything I'll mention here, that are intentionally done. So you'll see what I mean. Okay, sample 1, we measured heights or asked people to self-report their heights and their sex, and we estimated that effect size. So you'll see that is Cohen's d. That is, we did 1.8 standard deviations difference between men and women on average for how tall they are. You might know about this effect if, for example, you've interacted with men and women. You might have noticed over time that men tend to be on average taller than women. If you wanted to test that statistically, so that N that is per cell, you would need 12 people or 6 men and 6 women to have about an 80% chance of detecting a statistically significant difference in height. That is a very, very big effect. And I start with that because it is literally observable, right? Again, you've seen men and women before. Different sample, different question. We ask people, they report their age, and we ask them, how long is it going to be until you retire? And people that are older than the median think they are going to retire sooner than people that are younger than the median. That is also not an interesting research question. And you can see it has a slightly smaller effect, needs slightly larger sample size in order to reliably detect it. Women report owning more pairs of shoes than men. That is an idiosyncrasy of culture such that women have more shoes than men, and you can detect it with about 13 men and 13 women. Liberals, like Michelle Obama more than conservatives, measured in 2014. Michelle Obama, the wife of the then president of the United States. And indeed, there's a very large effect, 0.85, but considerably smaller than the ones above it. People who like spicy food are more likely to like Indian food than people who do not like spicy food. That effect is pretty big too, but again, smaller. Liberals think social equality is more important than do conservatives. In some ways, this is one of the working definitions of what it means to be liberal. And it is a pretty big effect, but already we're getting to a requirement of 33 per cell to even detect it reliably with a significant result. People who like eggs eat egg salad more often than those who dislike eggs. Again, we still haven't gotten to a hypothesis that is interesting. If you studied this, if someone came in with this research question, Leif, I'm really interested in egg salad, and I have this new hypothesis that I think people who like eggs are more likely to eat egg salad, I think we would all think that maybe that was not a very inspiring research question and you wouldn't bother collecting the data for it. Nevertheless, it is worth noting that you need almost 100 participants to have 80% power of detecting that effect. How about something almost as observable as men are taller than women? Men tend to weigh more than women also, but that effect is even smaller than the egg salad effect. So clearly, and again, clearly not an interesting question. And now we get to something that's about as close as we'll ever get to an interesting question. And you say smokers think smoking is less likely to kill them than do non-smokers. And there's lots of issues of third variables and reverse causality that make this a confounded relationship, so it should be very large. It's a D of 0.33. It requires 150 per cell to detect. This is our baseline understanding. These are a few intuitive things. And I list them here and go through them slowly so we can kind of hold those numbers in mind. Because then you can start thinking as you read new papers, what is the effect size they're reporting? How does it match to what's here? And so here's just one. There's a very famous paper in social psychology which shows that if you take Asian American women and you prime them with either their ethnic identity or their gender identity, you see differential performance on a math test. This is a 20-year-old paper or thereabouts. So that sounds maybe possible, but if we think about it, we would probably say it's surely not a very big effect, because the main things that you'll get will be signals of how good these people are at math, how many years of practice, how many classes they've taken. And it shouldn't matter all that much because most Asian American women are both aware that they are Asian and aware that they are women most of the time. So a subtle prime, like asking them to hold a pair of chopsticks, is not going to necessarily spontaneously change who they are as a person. How big was the effect? They get effect size of about 0.67. So 0.67, we can then look on our chart and say, that is bigger, considerably bigger, than the effect of liking eggs on eating egg salad, and only somewhat smaller than the effect of being liberal on how important it is to have social equality. My guess, if you're like me, you say, that feels wrong. That feels like that effect is being substantially overestimated. Now, that doesn't make the effect untrue, but it makes us kind of anxious. And actually for this one, I don't know if I return to my slides, but it has other features that will then tell us where we think that exaggerated effect size might have come from. How about another one? There's a different, very famous study published in Science, where if you ask someone to recall previous unethical acts, they show a preference for antiseptic wipes over, in this case, pencils. That is, the idea is if you've done something unethical, you feel the need to wash your hands of the bad deeds. Okay. And that preference is large, 75% versus 37.5%. Here, I've mostly been focusing on Cohen's d, but for this, we can actually, when it comes to percentages, we can start benchmarking that against lots of things that we know. I'm just going to use one. So here, 75 versus 37.5, we can compare that to the vote share difference of Donald Trump between Alabama versus Massachusetts. So for those of you who are non-American, which is many of you, you've still probably nevertheless heard of Donald Trump. And when I mention Alabama and Massachusetts, I have chosen one of the most positive leaning versus one of the most negative leaning states. And that difference is considerably smaller than the effect of this ethical priming effect, right? So once again, we would say it shouldn't be that big. It just shouldn't be that big of a change in preferences for an unrelated thing. Okay, great. So we say these are too surprising, basically. I'll mention this only briefly because this is the one that got a lot of press, and if you haven't read about it, it's worth knowing. There was now a little over 10 years ago, a paper published in a leading psychology journal by a leading researcher showing, in fact, that people have extrasensory perception. They can see the future, which, as it turns out, is necessarily untrue, or at least if it's true, we should definitely pack up and give up on our jobs and most of the things in life. Okay, but it was published in the journal, and he had evidence for it. And in fact, those effect sizes are of a range from 0.2 to about 0.5, which is relatively small, but it's not that small. And most notably, it's not zero. And so those are intrinsically surprising. And so there, we're going to worry almost automatically, because this isn't an effect where we're like, yeah, I bet the effect of seeing the future is small but reliable. Presumably, we all think, I bet it's 0 and 0, right? There isn't any error on it. So there's a lot of things that are like that. Okay, so that's surprise. The other thing we're going to want to look for are ways in which there are many ways that the data could be analyzed, and the specifications that we tend to see are at least somewhat idiosyncratic. The very first specification someone might try could also be p-hacked, honestly. Like if you're prepared to run 20 analyses, but your first one was lucky, it doesn't mean that you're not ready to p-hack or that those other 20 don't matter. But we'll tend to notice it most when there's deviations from what we would expect. So I'll just go through a couple of examples here. There was, for a while, a very hot topic in experimental social psychology was something called embodied cognition. It's died down largely as a result of the open science movement. But even for the time being, I'll just describe one of these studies. And this one was showing that if people are asked to extend their middle finger for an unrelated reason, that they nevertheless would experience the emotions and cognitions associated with when people would do that in regular life. I assume that that is a relatively universal shared cultural norm, but when you give someone the middle finger, that is your way of expressing dissatisfaction with them. Okay, so what happens? So they have people do this study where they raise their middle finger. How do they analyze it? So first of all, there's 58 people. we already said that sample size seems a little small for something so weird and unrelated. They restrict their analysis to only right-handed undergraduates, despite collecting data from both right-handed and left-handed people. They then drop 4 participants who are suspicious. Maybe it's reasonable to focus on right-handed people. I don't know why. That's okay. And certainly it's reasonable to drop people who are suspicious, but definitions of what constitutes suspicion often vary and reflect more latitude for the researchers. And then their final analysis is this, whether which finger is raised, by traits, by gender, where they've added gender for non-obvious reasons because it wasn't part of the initial hypothesis. And now they're controlling for baseline participant happiness. Again, not obvious for a simple experiment, which is mostly supposed to be fingers versus which finger is raised. And they show that the middle finger leads to greater hostility, but not more negativity on other traits, which is what's going to matter for the second study, where now they do a different form. So it's not middle finger. They now have thumbs up, same idea. We'll give their thumbs up when they are expressing satisfaction. They again focus this time only on right-handed undergraduates. They drop participants due to suspicion. They also use the gender factor for no obvious reason, but now they've removed the controls, even though they had them in the previous one. And now thumbs up, instead of it being the reverse of the previous one, they're saying it's actually generalized negativity. It's not about hostility, but also it only shows up for female participants. And so they take that simple effect within women as their critical test. Now we can read this, and this is only a 15-year-old paper, and me just describing it to you here, I'm trying to be literal, we would all think that's a lot of strange decisions to get to their final analysis. So you don't need to see the effect size, you don't need to see the p-value. You could just read this and say, it seems too weird. It's not the straightforward analysis I would have anticipated. Here's another one, and for some of these, you'll see the key piece is going to be somewhat hard to find. So this one is again a notable paper from 6 years ago, which showed that the level of anger expressed in counties based on their tweets was related to the levels of heart disease in that county. So county level is the unit of analysis, and the idea is that being angry causes heart disease, and you can detect it with tweets. So there's actually looks like a surprisingly strong result, and so you have to look pretty deep. So this is from a follow-up, something that was a paper that was published in PeerJ, critiquing it, and I'm going to spare you having to read the full paragraph. But what they basically discover is when you characterize the positivity and negativity of tweets, you have to decide on a dictionary of words. And the original researchers decided to exclude the word love from that set, even though it is rated as unambiguously positive, is associated with positivity in lots of ways. It has one special feature, and that is that if you include it, you don't get their result. But if you exclude it, you do get their published result. And so the inclusion of love, which I think if I'd asked you what name some positive words would have been high on your list, is the key to the effect. And that is only discoverable by going deep into their materials, finding out what's on their dictionary, finding out what decisions matter, and so on, in order to get to it. Here's a different one, again, very within the world of psychology, a very, very famous paper. And if you are in this world at all, you'll recognize many of the names of the authors there. And this was basically showing that you can narrow achievement gaps with a basic intervention, academic achievement gaps, with a basic intervention when people get to school, which sounds great. Of course, we want to improve education as much as possible. So all of that's great. But if you read through deep in the appendices, you will find references to exactly how they define the groups that are being considered, because the theory is that their intervention is going to work on people that are underrepresented or underprivileged, and so it's critical how you define them. And this text is basically saying, well, we vary it a little bit. How does that matter? Let's look at it. In experiment 1, the disadvantaged students are all first-generation students and all racial minorities. Sorry, I need to move my participant tab so I can see my own slides. So just for simplicity, you'll see the variable that I'm at. This says all Asian Americans in this sample qualify as disadvantaged. So you might think to yourself, that is a good definition, that is a bad definition, but for the time being, all we need is to know it is their definition. In experiment 2, they say disadvantaged students are all first-generation students and all African-American and Hispanic Latino students, which we can now think of as only first-generation Asian Americans are disadvantaged for this second study, even though, again, we're still in the US, still studying the same hypothesis. Experiment 3, disadvantaged students are, quote, classified all Asian students and all continuing generation European American students as not facing group-based disadvantages, i.e. their advantage, and all African American, Latino, Native, Pacific Islander, and first generation European students as facing group-based disadvantages. So once more here now, no Asian Americans count as disadvantaged in this set. So same hypothesis for all 3 studies, all run in the United States. Asian Americans are a large category of each of these, and they are treated differently in each of the analyses. Reading that, we would say no p-values, no effect sizes, no sample sizes. We would be concerned that maybe there's evidence of, at the very least, inadvertent p-hacking that might be going on. I'll return to that study momentarily. So I'm going to say that things you're looking for, that the study is too surprising, that there's many ways to analyze the data that seem arbitrary. And then the last one, this is related to PCurve, which you've all read about, that Alex mentioned when he was introducing me. We're going to look for a disproportionate number of p-values that are significant, but a little too high. So PCurve is this tool that, again, you've read about it, so I'm not spending a lot of time on it, but it basically looks at the distribution of p-values you would expect under different statistical power. So when you have a correctly powered study, say it's 80% powered, like we've alluded to, that means there's an 80% chance that you will get a significant result, p less than 0.05. But we can safely assume that publication bias is at least present and will last for a long time. So as readers, we only see those which are significant. So we lost 20%, and that's either a bad thing or a fine thing, and we can debate it. But now we want to care about, well, what about all those p-values less than 0.05? And what PCurve basically points out is that if you were at 80% power, there's approximately a 20-to-1 ratio of p-values that are less than 0.01 to those that fall between 0.04 and 0.05. That is, low p-values are considerably more likely than slightly higher ones. And lower is always more likely. So what does that mean? So imagine we ran 10 studies, 10 experiments, whatever, that are all independent, and we got p-values that look like this, 0.001, 0.002, and so on. 6 of those are below 0.01, and 1 is between 0.01 and 0.02, 1 between 0.02 and 0.03, 1 between 0.03 and 0.04, 1 between 0.04 and 0.05. Obviously, the exact p-value we observe is a function of the underlying power of the test, but also a function of chance. Just sort of like sometimes you get 0.04s, sometimes you get 0.01s, but the likelihood of them varies. And so that distribution I just showed you would generate a p-curve that looks like this. And that's pretty good. It's actually not great, as it turns out. If you read under 80% power, it is even, the blue line is plotted here, would be even steeper. That is more 0.01s, and you frequently don't observe any 0.04s. But if you see a p-curve that is like that, say you ran 10 studies and 20% of them are below 0.01 and 20% below 0.02 and so on, that's bad. That is what you would expect under the null, right? And here, if this intuition hasn't been built up from reading, I'll just describe it briefly. The nature of p-values, if you test something where there is no true effect and you just check random number generator and you run a t-test on the numbers, you would expect there to be a 1% chance that you would get a p-value less than 0.01. And you would expect there's a 2% chance that you would get a p-value less than 0.02, which means we think there's a 1% of all p-values are observed between 0.01 and 0.02, and that is true for all p-values. So there's a 1% chance of observing a p-value between 0.48 and 0.49, right? Uniform distribution is the worst case scenario. It means you really, really didn't study anything. But you can also get really bad p-curves that look like this. And they're unusual, but they are the result of two things. One, you're studying something that is not true, so your true statistical power was 0, or 5%, I should say, because we use 0.05 as our threshold. But then also a little bit of p-hacking means that the occasional 0.06 becomes a 0.04. And so a clustering of p-values between 0.01 and 0.05 are evidence of some p-values have been, if you will, shifted from their natural location greater than 0.05 downward through finding the right specification. Okay. There's lots of versions of these. I'll highlight a couple because they're high profile. This was a paper about power posing that generated lots and lots of critique, where basically you asked, Carney, Cuddy, and Yap asked people to take on poses that were either powerful, like sort of arms crossed across your chest, or very meek. There's a few examples, but they're sort of enclosed like this. And then they measure changes in hormones. And they showed that if you have a powerful pose, you have more testosterone, you take more risks. And you can sort of see it here. This is the results section. And I'm just highlighting, well, we don't know necessarily what the critical test is, but here's one we say is 0.045. That's awfully close to 0.05. Here's another is 0.01. This is 0.049, the last one. We would look at those with nothing else and just say, yeah, I don't know. Those don't look like very strong evidence. Let's go back to this one. This one I mentioned where with the different definitions of what constitutes whether Asians are disadvantaged or not. And I said, gosh, all those specifications should make us wary. Here are the results for each of those. So study 1 has a p-value of 0.03. Study 2 has a p-value of 0.11, so not even significant. Study 3, 0.045. So there we're getting all of the factors coming together. We would have read the paper and said, the analytic specifications seem strange. They seem arbitrary. And then the p-values tell us the same story. They say, these are too close to 0.05. It just doesn't seem like strong evidence. Okay, so following p-values ends up, I've given the short form here. It's a pretty useful heuristic when you're worried about selective reporting as this primary concern. There are lots of other concerns, right? I'm going to talk about fraud momentarily, but basically tracking p-values is something that is always going to be useful, and doing formal p-curves is useful as well. And you can go to our website to read the papers, see the app, and all of that. Great. The other thing you might look for, and I mentioned this just briefly, is that in a paper with multiple studies, which is normative in psychology or experimental economics, you would ask, are any of the replications truly exact? Are they doing the exact same study, or are they just similar? When they're similar, that's not bad, but we shouldn't think of them as providing evidence in the form of replication, right? And so it is normative for there to be no exact replication. So I mentioned that as well. How about this one? Here's a study, which I'll try to give a decent description to 45 undergraduates, 3 conditions, so the sample size is small. Some of them are asked to complete the study while they go into like a auditorium, or some of them are on stage, so they're up high. Some of them are on like the floor area, and then some are down in the orchestra pit. And so the researcher has incidentally manipulated how high or low the different participants are in the condition. And the dependent variable is how much hot sauce they deliver to someone else. So I think I have a brief paragraph showing you what the setup is. You can read it casually, but I'll just talk over it. Basically, hot sauce allocation, and there's some cover story like, we don't have the hot sauce researcher here with us, so you need to give hot sauce to the next participant. The amount of hot sauce they put in the little cup is seen as an implicit measure of like hostility or aggression, something like that. And it's been used in other studies. So great. So the amount of hot sauce is what's going to matter. And the independent variable then is height. These 3 locations. The dependent variable is the amount of hot sauce. What do we find? They say, as predicted, participants on stage in the high condition allocate more hot sauce or allocate less hot sauce than those do in the orchestra pit, the low condition. It has a t-value of 5.04 with a p less than 0.001. I haven't looked it up, but I think that's actually, it's going to be, the p-value is not just less than 0.001, it's probably less than 1 over 10 to the 6th or 7th or something like that. It's a very low p-value. Okay, great. We should look at that and we will say, is it surprising? Yes. Does it have a small sample size? Yes. However, is the specification weird? I haven't showed you, but it's basically straight up. They just measure the amount of hot sauce, no exclusions. Sounds good. Is the evidence weak? No, the evidence is strong, super duper strong, right? It's not just a t-value of 2 or even a t-value of 3, it's a t-value of 5, right? So it's like amazing, great. So you can look at that and you say, PCurve would look at that and think, this is great evidence, not good evidence, great evidence. In fact, there's an effect size with it. It implies a D of about 1.84. Now, you probably haven't memorized the slide I showed you 20 slides ago, which showed all those different effect sizes, but this is about the same size as men versus women in terms of height. So that seems really surprising, right? That where you do this hot sauce allocation as a function is just as important, just as influential as gender on height. So that seems odd. So I'm going to show you a plot. Here are the means for hot sauce allocation. This is in whatever, you'll pardon me for not knowing, grams or something like that. It's some measure. And then here are the standard deviations. Now, no one ever plots standard deviations like this, and God knows I'm not encouraging it. It's not like we often study in standard deviations. I plot them here so that you can see what was eventually noticed by Yuri Simonson. And that is that those standard deviations are really similar to each other. So I showed you one of these. I showed you study 3, but across each study in this paper, the standard deviations for the different conditions are very, very similar to each other. As it happens, they are so similar that they're impossibly similar to each other. So the effect sizes were way too big, and the results way too clean. The standard deviations are way too similar, and the way too similar you can put a benchmark on with a little bit of effort, and they're consistent, and that paper was retracted. And that lead author, Larry Sana, ended up resigning from his position. This wasn't p-hacking. This wasn't selective reporting. Someone faked the data. Now, fraud So fraud is a real problem. I mean this in lots of ways. And here, if you corner me, I can go on and on and on. But when I say it's a real problem, I mean it in a couple of ways. Let's start with the banal version that fits with the previous slides. It's a real problem because it defeats all of our other sensitivities. Fraud is unbounded by sampling error. It is unbounded by effect size. It doesn't need either a small sample or a large sample. If you're willing to commit fraud, you can have whatever effect you want. P-values don't look like 0.04, they look like whatever you want them to look like. And so it means that all of the things that we've learned about what to look for don't work with fraud. That is one part that makes it real. The other part that makes it a real problem, and here I am going to speculate, and I'll say, I think it's a real problem because it's common. If Larry Santa was the only person who ever committed fraud and they retracted that paper and he resigned his position, we would all say, well, we found the one bad apple, but now we're fine. Indeed, I'd say lots of people in my field have essentially done that. We found the one bad apple, then they find another bad apple and they say, now we found the two bad apples. Then you get another one, they say, now it's three, but it's fine. We've got all the bad apples until there's four. That's it, that'll be the last one, and so on. It's useful to think of it as more common than that. So what does fraud look like? Since we can't use the p-values to notice that. And the parenthetical here of it being stupid is important and sort of sad, or existentially terrifying is really what it should be. I'm going to describe what fraud looks like, but the only fraud that I know how to spot is fraud that we have spotted. And so therefore, it is kind of stupid fraud. The fraud that no one notices is still fraud, but it hasn't been noticed. So we only know stupid fraud. Fortunately, or unfortunately, there's still plenty of that. So stupid fraud results tend to look too good to be true, too big often. They tend to be highly significant in some of these cases that have been found. So very high t-values, very low p-values, and so on. The effects are super consistent, even when study designs change, and there's insufficient noise in the data. And then there's other features that might not make sense. So these are all things that are potential cues. They're going to be hard to use. Let me just show you a couple of examples. So here's one that is notable. The name to either remember or forget from this is the second is Derks-Meesters. They were in a study where they primed people with either messiness or tidiness, and then they asked them how much they'd be willing to pay for one of two t-shirts. And so some people are asked willingness to pay for that simple design. Other people are asked to say their willingness to pay for that complex design for those t-shirts. Priming, willingness to pay for t-shirt designs that aren't that different. If I told you nothing else, you would say, that sounds like a really tiny effect. I'm confused by the whole thing. It's not a tiny effect, it's large. So that's a pretty low p-value, looks like strong evidence. Here's the plot of the data, and there's a few things to note here. So the test statistic is in some ways underestimating how big the effect is. They're arguing that if you're merely primed with like seen words related to messiness, that you're willing to pay about 23 euros for that simple t-shirt, but only about 12 euros for the complex t-shirt. That sounds strange, that it would matter that much. This is a key plot that Yuri Simonson detected that he put together, and I have it here just because it's so clever. When you ask people their willingness to pay for things, real people, they tend to give answers that are multiples of 5. How much are you willing to pay for an extra large pizza? You say, I don't know, $20. How much are you willing to pay for a set of Bluetooth headphones? Like $70. What you do not say is $19. It's just a relatively uncommon thing, except in Derks-Meesters data, where that looks like people are just as comfortable saying $8 as they are 10. And that just doesn't happen with real people. So this was just one of the analyses that eventually led to that paper being retracted. This is the Yuri's paper about it. The effect sizes look too big, the results are too perfect or significant, that willingness to pay data doesn't make any sense, I just showed you. And then for these particular cases, those unique symptoms, similar standard deviations in the first one, oddly large effects or insensitivity of the variables in the latter, they occur across many, many studies and often across many papers for each of those authors. This is a totally different paper by Smeesters, and you don't even need to know what the axes are. You would look at this in almost any circumstance and say, those patterns are awfully consistent. Just eyeballing it, it looks strange. It's too perfect. Once you read the captions, you realize they're priming people with stereotypes and then handing them the materials in different colored folders. You're like, okay, yeah, no, that's none of this makes sense. Great. So let me tell you about one more case of fraud, and this one is super recent, and at least more than 0 of you have heard of it. So last week, yeah, literally a week ago, to the day, Yuri, Joe, and I published a blog post about a study that we think had fraudulent data. Short version of this. There's a paper published in 2012 by these 5 authors in PNAS. So for those of you who don't know the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, it's an ultra fancy journal that people spend their whole careers trying to get published in and all of that. And this paper was notable. It had been cited 500 times, whatever. Great. Also, the authors within my field, maybe even within adjacent fields, are famous people. So important paper. It shows that if you ask people in an insurance company, they run a field experiment, and they ask people to, before they submit their mileage driven, they sign their name, or they sign after. Like traditional form is you say, how many miles do you drive? You're like 25,000 miles, and then you sign your name. But other people, they ask them to sign at the beginning. And the idea is if you sign at the beginning, it makes you more honest, and so we get different reports. Great. Here's the report at the time, and you can see there, you say, great. This mean of 26,000 miles driven in one case versus only 24,000 in the other. We have an F test of 128 and super highly significant, 2,500 mile difference as merely a function of where people sign. So we'd say impressive. This went on to different governments and organizations using this manipulation. Now we fast forward, and a really, really unusual situation happened with this. And in 2020, the same authors, joined by 2 new authors, published a new paper in PNAS where they said, actually, we think we were wrong. So if ethics aside, it's kind of neat that the same set of authors got 2 PNASs, one saying yes, the other saying no to the same research problem. In this one, they talk about some failed replications, but most notably, they report the same data from that original study, and you can see the bottom row of the table there is has the same numbers as the screenshot above, but that's just the difference score in how much people drove. But what these authors noticed is actually, even before random assignment, there was a large difference in how many miles they drove. So it looks like a failure of random assignment in this particular case, which is really bad. And there was, but that's not the big story here. The big story is that was only the start. So famous paper, famous journal, famous authors. I'm not going to detail what we did in the blog post. I do encourage you to read it. It's kind of a fun read if you haven't seen it. And if you are anti-psychology, it's a good example. These are just a few things. Basically, there's a uniform distribution of miles instead of one that is a normal or a skewed normal. There's no rounding. That chart at the bottom is basically not unlike the Smeesters one. So if I asked you how many miles are on your car, you have to think to yourself, what would you say? And you might be the person who says, I don't know, 50,000 miles. Or maybe you're kind of precise and you'd say 52,000 miles. Or maybe you're really precise and you'd say 52,500 miles. In this data, people are just as likely to say that as they are to say 52,137 miles. That's not what people do. Okay, but leave that all aside. This is the ethical part, and I'll probably end up sort of stopping after this, because this is so one of the themes of this whole program that you all are involved in is trying to think about how the ethics of open science and pre-registration and transparency. And so I want to think about it in the context of this fraud case. So we know, we can observe that the data is fake. We shared that with the original authors. They all agree. No one says, no, I think you're misunderstanding. They're all like, yep, no, that data is fake. It's really fake, up and down, top to bottom. So we can say, what happened? There's 5 original authors, and we asked them basically what they know. 3 of the authors never saw the data at all back in 2012, never saw it. Then we had 2 other authors. One of them analyzed the data, like ran the t-test, put that in the paper. And the data that she was analyzing was forwarded to her by the 4th author. Okay. So the 4th author sounds potentially problematic. 4th author says, nope, I just forwarded the data I got from the insurance company. But it was from a long time ago. And he says, I don't have that old email because we've switched accounts. So I don't know. And I would have said, if that's all we knew, that is plausible. And for this conversation, we could even say, sure, let it be plausible. That the insurance company created fake data and sent it to the researcher, and then it was published. The ethical questions we want to think about are wait a minute, where do we draw the line in thinking about who's culpable in these situations? So let's say author 4 were guilty. Shouldn't we feel as though there's something strange about having research norms where the other authors never detected it, and not to criticize them, but they never were called upon to try to detect it? If you've read the post carefully, you'll note that author 5 actually noticed all kinds of things that were disconcerting about that data. At the time, he was like, man, these are too many miles. I don't know what's going on. But even he was placated, and they published the paper. We can also ask the question, and I have perspectives on all of these, that whose responsibility is it to find evidence of guilt or innocence? So here it is, the paper is fake, the data is fake. The original PNAS paper will be retracted. So in some ways, that's great, we've problem solved. But what if we actually care about figuring out who did it? Which I think is a reasonable thing to want to know. It's reasonable for lots of reasons. So if it is the 4th author, who is a famous person with 100 papers, we'd want to know because we would be skeptical of the other 100 papers. And if it's not that person, we would then be worried about the insurance company. And we'd be saying, wait, why they're faking data? I don't want my insurance company faking data. I pay them money. I want them to be on the up and up. That's their job. Academics, it's kind of our job. It's definitely the job of an industry based on accurate reporting. Who's supposed to figure that out? Is it the employer? Is it us? Right? Is it other academics? Most or all researchers identify themselves as ethical people. Let's assume all would do so. But we don't really know the best way to lead practices that encourage ethical behavior, including in these original 4 authors. So they were studying ethics. And so a couple of them written books, popular press books, New York Times best-selling books about ethics. And yet, within that set, at the very least, they published a paper that had fraud in it.
Leif,
Yeah,
if I may,
please.
if I may interject, I think we can go on for probably another 10 more minutes. But there was a question in the chat from Ignacio who's asking, what is the responsibility of the referees in this instance? How come this didn't get detected in the journal peer review process?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ignacio. So, first of all, there's one notable feature here, and this is not me throwing shade. It's just an amazing observation. The editor for this paper was Danny Kahneman. So like the by far the most notable living psychologist. And so like it's a celebrity fraud case all the way through. But I will tell you, I certainly don't hold it against Danny for not noticing this. And to a certain extent, I wouldn't hold it against the reviewers. They were shown a study that is described with enough detail that you can understand it, but insufficient detail that you would ever be able to notice any of the fraud. So the size of the effect looks big, 2,500 miles, but none of us have any idea what the variation, the natural variation is on mileage reporting, right? So if I worked for an insurance company, maybe I'd be able to benchmark it. And so the thing that we're really calling on reviewers to have done would have been to download the data set, run the analyses themselves, or make plots and draw inferences. The data is transparently fake if you do even a small number of things with it. But reviewers shouldn't be the ones that are the gatekeepers on that, as much as it'd be amazing if there was someone who could catch it there. Reviewers need to operate under the assumption that the thing that is handed to them is true and honest. And then they can do all the things that we talked about at the beginning that are in the form of, well, wait a minute, okay, is the sample size too small? Is this effect surprising relative to anything else that I know about the field? What about the p-values? How do they look? Are there exact replications? That's what reviewers should be doing. Once we open them up to, they're also supposed to be verifying the validity of the data. Their job as a reviewer is ballooned, and I'd say most people probably, and I would make myself inclusive, even though I've been looking at fraud for a decade now, I don't have the expertise. I could open up data sets and say, sometimes maybe I would be like, that looks weird, like I thought it did, but most of the time I would never notice. And so in this particular case, it's weird to say because I know something went wrong, but I would say I don't blame the reviewers. I bet the reviewers blame themselves. The anonymous reviewers out there who presumably have heard about this at this point are probably saying, I can't believe I never thought to ask that question or look a little bit more closely. And if they came to me and said that, I would say, no, you shouldn't feel bad. This would have happened to me too. It's only because we were able to look at it now, which gets to this bullet point I have here, which in all of the open science discussion, like we're talking about pre-registration and analysis plans, across the social sciences, posting data was purely counter-normative. It wasn't that no one did it, but it was not common until fairly recently. Now it's fairly common in economics, required in some journals, required in some journals in political science, encouraged in lots of journals. But most notably at PNAS in 2012, it was not required or even encouraged. In 2020, when they did that follow-up paper, the norms had shifted and they strongly encouraged and almost required data posting, which meant they posted that old data, which meant that now you had the capacity for instead of it being 2 reviewers, it could now be hundreds or conceivably thousands of academics who would download the data and look at it themselves. And so, which is where we came in, right? And again, this data set doesn't require specialized statistical skills to notice. It requires opening it and looking at it in a few different ways. And actually for this, I know I'm dangerously close to a tangent, but I'll own it and I'll be on even more of a tangent. When this data was posted in 2020, we read this paper, the 2020 paper, for our weekly journal discussion group. And for that, I downloaded the data and I made a plot of the data, but I made a plot that was that, as it happened, didn't inform the questions relevant here. I didn't make a histogram of the values. I didn't look at the font choices, and I didn't look at a bunch of other things that were in there in the data that were transparently clear. I'd done something that was functionally a scatter plot comparing pre-test mileage to post-test mileage, because I wanted to see what the correlation was. And I observed, and Joe, my colleague, pointed out to me how close I was to noticing something that basically I had said in the email, you know, it's funny, I would have expected there to be a relationship between these, but it looks like there's not. That's interesting. And that was it. If I plotted the data in any number of other ways, instead of it looking kind of quirky, I would have said, whoa, something's wrong. That's me downloading the data, doing something with it, analyzing it, making a chart, and sharing it. And even that didn't catch this fraud, right? So it's just really hard to put that on the shoulders of a reviewer, even though it'd be great if the reviewers caught it. Alex, you say I have just a few minutes. This case is more interesting than the other stuff I have. I know people haven't been very chatty, which is fine, but if people want to ask any questions or express strong opinions about this case, they can. Because it's so top of mind, and I've talked to lots and lots of journalists about it, I'm happy to give you like the inside scoop, or even not, and you can come to my office hours whenever those happen, and then you can ask for the inside scoop then, and I'll probably still remember it. Let me, this is just relative to the fraud one, so less exciting. I'll give you one more version that falls in between. We already said that fraud looks like big effects that are perfect. You can also get things that look big for different reasons. And I'll just show you just one example. This is one that if you read our blog, which is probably none of you, but if you read it going forward, thanks. We talk about this. We ran a replication of this study, but I'll show you what the original finding looks like. Participants are supposed to write about something they felt curious about. And then they do some hypothetical credit card reward that's related to something else. They seem really unrelated, and yet the effect sizes are quite large. Here's how that induced curiosity affects indulgence, and then again, in curiosity affecting desire for rewards. And you get a t-value, if you look down there, of 13.66. That's way, way too high for incidental curiosity on something unrelated. So what's going on? Obviously, if you're like me, and I hate to be so negative, but I immediately think that there's something fraudulent. It's not quite fraud, but it's also not great. So Joe and I got the original materials. In the normal condition, people have said, earlier you stated a normal situation, put yourself in that normal situation and make a decision. And people in the curiosity condition said, earlier stated that you are curious. Read the definition of curiosity again. Curiosity is often described as a state of high arousal that motivates exploratory behavior in order to acquire new knowledge or experiences. Put yourself into this aroused and exploratory state when you make a decision on the next screen. They basically told people, behave as though you were trying to explore, and then the dependent variable, that one with a t-value of 13, was some version of how much do you want to explore? So they get a very large effect, not because of fraud, not because of p-hacking, but because there's imperfect experimental control. Okay, so there's lots of things to look at. This is me summarizing what's been in there. I think I'll just end. I have a blog, you can read it. I wrote something on the renaissance of methods. And we run all of these sites. The blog is Data Colada, as predicted, is a pre-registration site. PCurve is about data analysis, and ResearchBox is a site that is designed for the easy posting of data, materials, and pre-registrations, all of which are hopefully useful to all of you for any research that you do. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.